Time is a patient scribe. It carves the glories of empires into stone, and with the same hand erases them in the breath of the desert. For Yusuf al-Karim, a history professor in Baghdad, this truth was more than an academic concept. It was the foundation of his life. For years, he had walked the cool corridors of libraries, studying Sumerian tablets, Babylonian scrolls, and maps of the campaigns of Cyrus, Alexander, and Harun al-Rashid. He dreamed of teaching his students about the unbroken thread that linked the present to the civilizations that had flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates. But in 1915, the distant roar of artillery drowned out the voice of his lessons. The Ottoman Empire, his sovereign, did not ask for volunteers. It requisitioned bodies. At 33, Yusuf exchanged pen for sword, chalkboard for Mauser rifle, and a lecture hall for the dust of the trenches. He was made a lieutenant, not for skill with weapons, but because he could read maps and speak Turkish, Arabic, and halting French. Among Anatolian peasant soldiers and young men from Damascus, he became an unlikely bridge between worlds that rarely touched. The heat of Mesopotamia was merciless. The sun felt like a blade on the skin, the sand a serpent coiling into boots, rifles, lungs. Yusuf read the battlefield as if it were a manuscript, each detail a symbol. Trenches scored the earth like hurried lines, unburied bodies, footnotes in the bloody margin of history. The air was saturated with the acrid tang of gunpowder, the sickly sweet stench of death, and the sour bite of sweat. Flies, persistent and everywhere, droned like an ancient chorus, indifferent to human suffering. Around him, young men aged in weeks. Mehmetchiks from Anatolia, once used to tilling soil, now shoveled mud, built sandbag walls, and endured rat infestations. Many coughed blood from malaria, others, wasted by dysentery, could barely stand. As Yusuf walked the line, he mentally recorded faces and names, as if history might forget them. Captain Osman, his immediate superior, was a man of sharp angles. He believed discipline was more valuable than bread, and that a fearful soldier was more useful than a satisfied one. To him, Yusuf was just a misplaced academic, useful only for keeping records and passing orders. Yet the professor sensed in Osman something the captain would never voice aloud, a deep fatigue hidden beneath the armor of command. The news came at dusk, carried by a messenger like an omen. British and Indian forces were advancing along the Tigris, erecting pontoon bridges and bringing with them the promise of aerial bombardment. Days earlier, Yusuf had seen a lone biplane slicing the sky, a metal vulture searching for prey. Now, the threat was real. Osman ordered the barricades reinforced. The silence that followed was not obedience, but resignation. At night, when the wind eased and the desert cold crept in, Yusuf pulled a small leather notebook from the inner pocket of his coat. It was not a diary. It was a record for no one. His words sought no recipient. They were seeds cast into the sand. He wrote about the feel of hot sand in his boots, about the face of a soldier who still smiled despite his fever, and about the brutal contrast between the calm of a Tigris sunset and the distant thunder of artillery. When he finished, he rolled the page, tied it with a makeshift thread, and with his hands dug a small space beneath a stone near the trench. He buried the paper as one might plant something that might never grow. At dawn, the horizon burned gold with false promise. Among the mirages, Yusuf spotted columns of smoke, and with them the certainty that the day would bring more than heat. Being a teacher was, at its heart, telling the stories of men and their deeds. Now he was trapped inside one, unsure if he would live to tell its end. The news arrived like a muffled thunderclap, cutting through the afternoon heat. A messenger, covered in dust and soot, brought the order straight from command. The British had begun crossing the Tigris. Enemy columns advanced with meticulous discipline, and pontoon bridges were already appearing like metal scars over the current. For Yusuf, who knew the river not only as geography but as an artery of Mesopotamian history, it was more than a military threat. It was a symbolic invasion, an act tearing through centuries of memory. Captain Osman received the report without surprise, his eyes fixed on the map spread across a crate of ammunition, as if he could halt the enemy's advance by sheer force of will. He ordered immediate reinforcement of the riverbank, and the message ran through the trench like a fevered whisper. The mission was clear: prevent the enemy from securing the crossing. The subtext, however, was another matter. Many would not return. The heat made every movement torture. Sweat streamed down Yusuf's temples, soaking his uniform and gluing the coarse fabric to his skin. The rough, overworn cloth scraped like sandpaper. Persistent flies landed on lips, on open wounds, on the moldy bread some still kept out of desperation. The air carried the smell of damp earth, mingled with the sickly, sweet, rotting stench from the trenches. Yusuf tried, in vain, to push away the image of a Turkish and a British body lying side by side, covered by the same dust, equals in the silence of death. He moved along the defensive line, speaking to small groups. His words were not orders, but presence. He asked about fever, about water, about letters from home. Most gave no reply. Others merely nodded, hollow-eyed with exhaustion. Among them was Hassan, a young man from Aleppo who claimed to know entire poems by al-Mutanabbi. Sitting in the frail shade of a sandbag wall, Hassan recited a few verses, his voice trembling, as if clinging to a world that no longer existed. Yusuf listened in silence, grateful for the brief interruption to the monotony of fear. Osman, meanwhile, moved with military precision. He checked the positions of the machine guns, inspected ammunition reserves, and crushed hesitation with a glance sharp enough to cut. For him, weakness was an invitation to defeat. Yusuf understood that beneath the rigidity there was calculation. Osman believed blind obedience could save more lives than mercy. But for men living each minute in the mud, that logic was as distant as the stars. At dusk, the distant drone of an aircraft engine sliced the air. Everyone ducked instinctively. Yusuf looked up to see the dark silhouette of a biplane crossing the sky, followed by another. Their shadows fell over the sand like ill-omened birds. A flash erupted only a few hundred meters away, throwing up a cloud of sand and smoke. The smell of burnt gunpowder stung his nostrils, and cries rose from where the blast had struck. The attack lasted minutes, but left the silence heavy with dust and foreboding. That night, Yusuf returned to his notebook. His hands trembled as he wrote. He described Hassan's face as he recited, Osman's steady line over the map, the dry sound of shovels digging in, and the growing weight of knowing that the river, life's symbol for generations, might soon become a graveyard. He rolled the page and buried it under a stone, marking the spot in his mind. He didn't know if anyone would ever read those words. Perhaps they were not meant to be read. Perhaps they were only meant not to be forgotten. The pre-dawn hours brought a cold wind carrying the scent of water. The Tigris was near, invisible in the dark, but audible in the murmuring current. Yusuf could not sleep.
He walked to the edge of the trench and stared toward the horizon. In the silence between the occasional gunshots, he could hear his own heartbeat, steady like a distant drum. He felt something approaching, not just the battle, but a personal trial, the moment he would have to choose between surviving and preserving what made him who he was.
The days dragged on like long shadows beneath the merciless sun. Each dawn felt harsher than the last, and the white desert light spared nothing. It burned the skin, cracked the lips, and turned even the air into an enemy. Yusuf felt the sand sticking to his sweat, forming a rough film over his body. The dry taste of dust was constant in his mouth, mingled with the metallic tang of water kept far too long in dented tin canteens. Life in the trenches was a constant siege of the senses. The smell was the worst, a suffocating blend of gunpowder, sweat, excrement, urine, and, above all, the sickly sweet rot of unburied corpses. Many lay just meters away in no man's land, others hastily covered by thin layers of sand. Fat, brazen rats scurried along the trench edges as if they owned the place, chewing through rations, boot leather, and sometimes human flesh. Flies swarmed in thick clouds, landing on eyes, on wounds, even on the utensils used for eating. Water was a rare luxury. Often cloudy, with floating particles, it carried the taste of river mud and rust. Yusuf knew the Tigris was close, but it seemed unreachable, guarded by treacherous currents and enemy artillery. Food was no better. Hard bread, sometimes moldy, a handful of dates, and, on lucky days, a bit of tough, heat-dried meat. Disease was constant as the distant sound of artillery. Dysentery and malaria claimed more lives than bullets. Men once strong withered before his eyes. Yusuf helped where he could, a wet cloth on a fevered brow, a sip from his own water, or simply listening to the delirium of someone calling for their mother. It wasn't the duty of an officer, but it was the only thing that kept him feeling human. One afternoon, Hassan, the young man from Aleppo, was struck by such a high fever that he began reciting disjointed verses, mixing classical Arabic poetry with invented words. Yusuf sat by his side, holding his hand as explosions echoed in the distance. Later, he wrote about it in his notebook, burying another page beneath the stones, as if storing testimony for a historian who might not be born. Captain Osman remained rigid. He ordered fortifications strengthened even when exhaustion was etched into every face. He inspected sentry posts, punished the slightest lapse, and spoke little, but always in a tone that left no room for argument. Yusuf understood that Osman's hardness had roots in desperation, dwindling supplies, no air support, and a chain of command far away, more concerned with reports than with men. The sound of British planes became more frequent. At first, they came only 2 or 3 times a week. Now, the shadows of biplanes cut across the ground almost daily. Yusuf learned to recognize the hum of their engines before they appeared on the horizon. Each approach meant rushing to makeshift shelters, pressing flat against the earth, and hoping luck would be enough to escape the bombs. At night, when the heat gave way to the biting cold, Yusuf looked up at the star-filled sky and thought of the cities he had studied, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, and the certainty that they too had once been stages for fear and defiance. He felt part of a cycle repeating since antiquity, where armies crossed rivers, besieged cities, and wrote history in blood. The difference now was that he was inside it, without the safe distance of a page. One morning, an order arrived that would change the course of the coming days. The unit was to march in forced movement to protect a vulnerable point along the Tigris's bank. The crossing would be inevitable. Yusuf looked at his men, sunburned faces, hollow eyes, bodies marked by hunger and sickness, and felt the weight of being the officer who had to lead them.
They weren't attentive students like in his university days. They were survivors on the edge of collapse. That night, he wrote, "Perhaps tomorrow we will cross the same river where kings and merchants once sought fortune. Today, we cross to flee death or meet it. May Allah grant that at least one of us lives to tell." He buried the page beneath a broad stone, marking the spot with an almost invisible scratch. Then he closed his eyes, knowing his sleep would be light, broken by the inevitable sound of the war drawing closer.
Dawn came without wind, and the air felt trapped, heavy, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Yusuf woke before the call, his mind already alert with premonition. Around him, the men moved in silence, gathering the few possessions they had: a canteen, a piece of bread, a folded photograph in a pocket. There was no conversation, only quick glances that avoided the horizon. Captain Osman assembled the group near a shallow rise. The map, spread on the ground, showed the banks of the Tigris and the points where the British were attempting to consolidate their crossing. The mission was simple in theory and almost impossible in practice. Cross at a narrow point, avoid enemy patrols, and reach the other side to reinforce an isolated garrison. Yusuf studied the lines and symbols, but he saw more than tactics. He saw history. This same river, which for millennia had given life to empires, was now a lethal barrier. The march began with the sun still low, but the heat came quickly. Boots sunk into loose sand, each step draining energy like a toll to the desert. Distant explosions were a constant reminder that they moved under the reach of unseen eyes. At every pause, Yusuf mentally recorded the state of the men. One limped quietly, another clutched his stomach, another kept his gaze fixed on the ground, as if eye contact might shatter his fragile armor of courage. As they neared the river, the sound of its current mingled with the sharp crack of gunfire. An enemy advance group had spotted them. Osman shouted orders, and the men dove for cover behind rocks and shallow depressions. Yusuf's heart pounded as bullets struck the sand nearby, kicking up small clouds. He returned fire, but when he saw Hassan, still feverish, struggling with his rifle, he broke cover to reach him. Dragging him back behind a ridge, Yusuf felt the weight of a body too weak to fight. After minutes that felt like hours, the enemy pulled back, and silence returned, broken only by the uneven sound of the river. The group pushed forward until the Tigris lay before them, running fast and dark, reflecting the sun like broken glass. Osman met Yusuf's eyes and nodded. The crossing would begin. The water was freezing, a violent shock against the desert heat. Yusuf felt the current pulling at his legs, the weight of his soaked uniform making each movement harder. Some men, too exhausted, slipped beneath the surface. Others, in desperation, dropped their weapons to stay afloat. Yusuf gripped Hassan by the shoulder, straining every muscle to keep him above water. The roar of the river was deafening, but above it came a sharper sound, the drone of enemy aircraft. The first bombs fell on the far bank, sending up columns of water and mud. Yusuf didn't look back. He pushed Hassan and two others toward a sandbar in midstream, catching their breath before the last stretch. The explosions drew closer, each one followed by a flash that burned the eyes. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the scent of muddy water. When they finally reached the far bank, Yusuf collapsed to his knees, arms trembling, lungs burning. Looking back, he saw that half the group was gone. Some bodies floated, others were caught in the current. Hassan, alive, coughed violently, spitting water and blood. Yusuf held his face, and for the first time since the war began, let his tears fall freely. In the distance, British machine guns began to chatter again, and Osman, allowing no time for grief, ordered everyone to move toward the cover of sparse trees. Yusuf helped Hassan to his feet,
and even in his exhaustion, he felt a cold determination grow inside him. This was no longer only about following orders or survival. It was about ensuring that even in silence, it would be recorded that they had fought, crossed, and endured. That night, under a moonless sky, Yusuf wrote in his notebook, "Today, the river took more than it gave, but as long as one man stands, there will be memory. And as long as there is memory, we are not dead." He buried the page beneath a dead log, as if planting one last whisper for the future.
The next day began with a strange silence. It wasn't peace. It was the suspended breath of something about to collapse. The sparse trees that offered shelter cast little shade, and the air was heavy with smoke and fine dust. Yusuf woke with a dry throat and a dull ache in his muscles, a cruel reminder of the crossing the day before. Hassan was still asleep, fever consuming him, breathing short and uneven. Osman quickly organized the defense. The isolated garrison they had come to reinforce counted barely 20 men, all exhausted and hungry. The trenches were shallow, improvised, and far too close to the river, meaning that any attack could encircle them with ease. Yusuf moved along the positions, offering encouragement, helping to rearrange sandbags, checking what little ammunition remained. There was little to give beyond words, and he knew that at this stage, words carried little weight against hunger and fear. By noon, the attack began. First came artillery fire from the opposite bank. Explosions sent up columns of mud and splintered wood from their makeshift structures. The sound was so loud that Yusuf's chest vibrated with each impact. Then came the rattle of machine guns, sweeping over the trench tops. Men shouted orders, shouted names, some just shouted. Yusuf kept low, firing when he could, dragging the wounded back when he had the chance. Hassan, even in his weakened state, insisted on holding his rifle steady against a log. Yusuf wanted to order him back, but there was no time. A nearby explosion threw them both to the ground. The ringing in Yusuf's ears lasted an eternity. But when his hearing returned, Hassan was still. His body lay unmoving, eyes fixed on the sky. Yusuf couldn't stop, not in that moment. The fight dragged on for hours until the light began to fade. British forces, supported by aircraft, advanced in a tightening arc. Osman gathered the survivors and announced that the position could not be held. The retreat would be through the sparse woodland, heading inland. Yusuf knew what that meant, leaving behind the dead and those too badly wounded to move. By nightfall, far from the river, they found refuge among a cluster of rocks. Some men slept sitting up. Others stared into the dark, as if they could see beyond it. Yusuf sat alone, took out his notebook, and by the faint glow of a lamp, began to write. This was no longer a record for himself. It was a farewell. If these lines survive me, let it be known that we were ordinary men cast against the tide of history. We did not fight for glory, but because the current carried us here. I have buried my words in the desert, and perhaps they will never be found. But if they are, let my name fade, and let my voice resound with the dead. May Allah receive us as He received those who once slept by the banks of the Tigris, when the world was still young. He folded the page carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and searched for a crack between the rocks. He placed the bundle inside, covering it with sand and small stones. He stared at the spot for a moment, as if engraving it into memory. When he rose, he felt an unexpected lightness, as though the heaviest part of himself had been left buried there. Before dawn, before the first streak of light touched the horizon, British aircraft returned. There was no siren, no warning, only Osman's sudden shout and the thunder of bombs. Yusuf ran to help a soldier trapped beneath a fallen log, but a second explosion threw him hard to the ground. The pain came swiftly, followed by deep, silent darkness.
the sun rose over a quiet scene. Among the stones, a small, untouched bundle remained, guarding the last whisper of Mesopotamia.